December 21st, 1945. The air inside the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg is heavy with the smell of ether and damp wool. Outside, the ruins of a conquered Germany are buried under a freezing winter fog. Inside room 110, the only sound is the labored, shallow breathing of a man who spent his life surrounded by the roar of cannon fire. General George S. Patton, the driving force of the Third Army, lies paralyzed, broken not by a German Tiger tank, but by a low-speed collision in a staff car 12 days prior. At 5:55 p.m., the breathing stops. The most aggressive warrior of the 20th century is dead. 35 miles away in Frankfurt, a secure telephone rings in the office of Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. He lifts the receiver, listens to the brief report, and slowly sets it back down. There is no outburst of grief. There is no immediate speech. Instead, a profound, complicated silence fills the room. For 3 decades, Eisenhower had been Patton's friend, his boss, his protector, and finally, his executioner. Now, staring into the grey post-war twilight, Eisenhower is forced to confront a reality he has evaded for years, admitting exactly what George Patton was to him, and what the cost of that friendship truly was. To understand the complex burden Eisenhower carried at that hospital bed in 1945, we must first rewind 26 years. The story does not begin with the grand strategies of Europe, but in the grease and mud of Camp Meade, Maryland, in 1919. The Great War is over. The trenches are being filled in, but 2 officers are out in the field, dismantling a French Renault tank piece by piece. One is George S. Patton, wealthy, flamboyant, a combat hero who led tanks into battle in France. He wears custom-tailored uniforms and speaks of war as a glorious spiritual destiny. The other is Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Kansas farm boy who missed the fighting, stuck stateside training troops, harboring a deep, quiet frustration that his career might be over before it truly began. They are an unlikely pair. Patton is fire, Eisenhower is ice. Yet, in these quiet post-war years, they forge a bond closer than brothers. They spend their evenings debating the future of warfare, convinced that the next war will be decided by speed and armor, not static trenches. They write articles together. They challenge the War Department's doctrine. They are the outcasts of a shrinking peacetime army, finding solace in each other's intellect. At this stage, Patton is the senior figure, the mentor, the man with the combat ribbon. Eisenhower is the junior partner, absorbing the lessons, admiring Patton's aggressive spirit. But history has a way of inverting relationships. As the 1920s and 30s grind on, the dynamic shifts imperceptibly. Patton remains the warrior, playing polo, writing poetry, buying yachts, and offending superiors with his brashness. He is a man out of time, waiting for a conflict that suits his violent talents. Eisenhower, however, takes a different path. He becomes the consummate staff officer. He learns the invisible machinery of war, logistics, diplomacy, administration. He serves under General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines, mastering the art of managing difficult egos. When the Japanese strike Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States Army is suddenly in desperate need of leaders. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, looks at his roster. He does not need a gladiator to run the war, he needs an architect. He chooses Eisenhower. In a dizzying span of months, the hierarchy flips. Eisenhower rockets past his old friend in rank. By 1942, the former junior partner is now the supreme commander of Allied forces in the European theatre. Patton, the man who once taught Eisenhower how to strip a tank engine, is now his subordinate. The friction is immediate, though buried under professional courtesy. Patton loves Eisenhower, but privately thinks him too cautious, too political, a clerk in uniform. Eisenhower respects Patton's genius for battle, but fears his volatility. He knows that Patton is a loaded weapon, dangerous to the enemy, but liable to explode in the hands of the man holding him. November 1942. Operation Torch. The invasion of North Africa. This is the first test. Eisenhower sits in the dank tunnels of Gibraltar, the weight of the alliance on his shoulders. He unleashes Patton on the shores of Morocco. The results are electric. Patton drives his men relentlessly. He captures Casablanca. He transforms the demoralized US II Corps after the humiliation at Kasserine Pass, whipping them into a lethal fighting force within weeks. Eisenhower watches from Algiers, relieved. His old friend is delivering the victories the Allies desperately need. The gamble seems to be paying off. Patton is the hammer, and Eisenhower is the hand that swings it. But the Desert War is merely a prelude. As the Allies look north across the Mediterranean toward Sicily, the cracks in the iron relationship are about to widen into a chasm. The very qualities that make Patton a god of war, his arrogance, his lack of filter, his terrifying intensity, are about to collide with the delicate political reality Eisenhower is trying to hold together. July 1943. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. The heat is suffocating, dust coating every surface of the mobile headquarters. Here, George Patton is in his element. He treats the campaign not as a strategic maneuver, but as a personal race. His rival is not just the German army, but the British commander, Bernard Law Montgomery. Patton drives the 7th Army relentlessly across the rugged Sicilian terrain. He enters Palermo in triumph. He pushes his infantry beyond the limits of endurance to reach Messina before the British. It is a dazzling display of speed and aggression. To the public back home, he is old blood and guts, the hero who delivers victories. But inside the medical tents, the glory dissolves into something ugly. August 3rd, 1943. The 15th Evacuation Hospital. Patton walks among the wounded. He sees Private Charles Cool sitting on a supply box, physically uninjured but shivering with combat fatigue. Patton's temper, frayed by the heat and the stress of command, snaps. He calls the soldier a coward. He strikes him across the face with his gloves. He kicks him out of the tent. 7 days later, it happens again. This time with Private Paul Bennett. Patton draws his pistol, threatening to execute the weeping soldier for malingering, and strikes him violently. The shock in the medical tent is palpable. The nurses are stunned. The corpsmen stand frozen. The news travels up the chain of command like a shockwave. When the report lands on Eisenhower's desk in Algiers, the color drains from his face. This is not a tactical error. It is a court-martial offense. The press is circling. Members of Congress are demanding Patton be stripped of his command and sent home in disgrace. For any other general, this would be the end. Eisenhower is trapped in a brutal dilemma. He knows Patton's behavior is inexcusable. It violates every principle of leadership Eisenhower holds dear, specifically the care and respect for the citizen soldier. His staff urges him to fire Patton. It is the safe political move. It is the moral move. But Eisenhower looks at the map of Europe. He looks at the fortress of France waiting across the Channel. He knows that the invasion of Normandy will be the hardest battle in human history. He needs a killer. He needs a man who can look at a wall of German steel and smash through it through sheer force of will. He has many good generals, but he has only one Patton. Eisenhower makes a cold, calculated decision. He writes a blistering letter to Patton, dressing him down like a delinquent schoolboy. He forces Patton to apologize to the troops, a humiliation that nearly breaks the proud cavalryman's spirit. But he does not fire him. He keeps the scandal contained as long as possible. In a private memo, Eisenhower writes that Patton is indispensable to the war effort. It is an admission of necessity, not affection. He saves Patton not out of friendship, but because he views him as a unique piece of military ordnance, too dangerous to discard, too volatile to trust completely. So, while the war moves to the mainland of Italy, Patton is put in the doghouse. He is left behind in Sicily, pacing his villa like a caged tiger, convinced his career is over. Eisenhower leaves him there to rot, to think, and to wait. The Supreme Commander is saving his problem child for the one specific moment when the polite rules of war no longer apply. Spring 1944. The English countryside is blooming, but George Patton is in purgatory. While Eisenhower manages the colossal logistics of the upcoming D-Day invasion, he assigns Patton a command that exists only on paper. The 1st United States Army Group, to the German High Command, this phantom army is a terrifying threat. A massive force poised directly across the narrowest part of the Channel, aimed at Pas-de-Calais. Intelligence reports convinced Hitler that Patton is coming. But the reality is a farce. The tanks are inflatable rubber balloons. The barracks are empty plywood facades. The radio traffic is pre-recorded scripts played by signal corpsmen. Eisenhower is using Patton's reputation as a psychological weapon. He knows the Germans fear Patton more than any other Allied commander. As long as Patton is visible in Dover, the German 15th Army will stay pinned in Calais, waiting for an invasion that will never come. For Eisenhower, this is a masterstroke of strategic deception. For Patton, it is a living death. He paces his headquarters in Knutsford, consumed by a paranoid fear that the war will end while he sits on the sidelines. He writes in his diary, pouring out his anguish, believing that Eisenhower and destiny have abandoned him. He watches June 6th, D-Day, come and go from a distance, stuck listening to the BBC while other men stormed the beaches. Eisenhower keeps the sword sheathed, ignoring Patton's pleading letters, letting the tension build until the breaking point. July 1944. Eisenhower finally unlocks the cage. He flies Patton to Normandy and hands him the newly activated Third Army. The Allies are bogged down in the claustrophobic hell of the hedgerows, fighting for mere yards a day. The stalemate is brutal. Eisenhower needs movement. On July 25th, Operation Cobra shatters the German line. Patton pours through the breach like water through a burst dam. This is the moment the dynamic shifts again. Eisenhower sits at Supreme Headquarters, staring at the massive map of Europe, trying to coordinate a broad front, a methodical, steady advance of all Allied armies to destroy the German military machine piece by piece. Patton, however, is fighting a different war. He ignores flanks. He ignores secure supply lines. He orders his commanders not to stop, saying, "I don't care if you sleep. We are going to kill Germans." In 2 weeks, the Third Army races 400 miles, encircling huge pockets of enemy troops. It is a blitzkrieg that outpaces even the German doctrine. Eisenhower watches the reports with a mix of awe and anxiety. Patton is moving so fast he is literally running off the maps issued to the staff. He is liberating France faster than Eisenhower can supply him. The tactical disconnect becomes the central tension of the campaign. Eisenhower is fighting a war of logistics and alliances. Patton is fighting a war of momentum. One wants to secure victory. The other wants to chase glory. By September 1944, the Third Army is not stopped by the Wehrmacht, but by physics. They have advanced so far, so fast, that the supply trucks, the famous Red Ball Express, cannot keep up. The tanks are running on fumes. Eisenhower faces a nightmare of resource allocation. He has a limited pool of gasoline and ammunition. On the northern flank, British Field Marshal Montgomery is proposing a daring, massive airborne strike into Holland called Operation Market Garden. He promises Eisenhower a quick dagger thrust into the heart of Germany. Eisenhower makes the call. He prioritizes Montgomery. He turns off the tap for the Third Army. For Patton, this is a betrayal of biblical proportions. He flies to Eisenhower's headquarters, begging, pleading, and pounding the map. He claims that with just 400,000 gallons of gasoline, he can punch through the Siegfried Line and be in Berlin before winter. He argues that halting now gives the Germans time to regroup. A fatal mistake. Eisenhower stands firm. He looks at the logistics charts, not the glory. He orders Patton to halt. The Third Army sits idle in the mud of Lorraine, its engines silent. Patton resorts to desperate measures, sending raiding parties to hijack fuel trucks from other American units, fighting a logistical civil war, while Eisenhower tries to balance the fragile ego of the British alliance. The decision creates a permanent scar. Patton believes Eisenhower is prolonging the war. Eisenhower believes Patton is incapable of understanding the math of victory. As the armies stall at the German border, a different kind of danger emerges. The closer the Allies get to victory, the more the war becomes political. Eisenhower is no longer just a general. He is a statesman, balancing the interests of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. He walks a tightrope of international diplomacy. Patton, conversely, views diplomacy with contempt. He sees the world in binary, warriors and cowards. As the Allies begin to uncover the political landscape of post-war Europe, Patton cannot keep his mouth shut. He openly disparages the Russians, whom the official Allied policy treats as friends. He mocks the denazification protocols. Every time Patton speaks to a reporter, Eisenhower flinches. The Supreme Commander spends hours writing letters of apology, smoothing over ruffled feathers in Washington and London. He confides in his staff that Patton is a child regarding politics. The tension shifts from the battlefield to the headquarters. Eisenhower realizes that while Patton is the perfect instrument for killing the enemy, he is a liability for the peace that must follow. He keeps Patton on a short leash, terrified that one slip of the tongue will shatter the Allied coalition before the Germans effectively surrender. But just as Eisenhower begins to question the utility of keeping his volatile friend in command, the German army proves Patton's tactical instincts right. The enemy has used the lull to regroup. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Hitler is assembling one last desperate gambler's throw. December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes forest, 5:30 a.m. The silence of the Ghost Front is shattered by the roar of 1,600 German artillery pieces. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks, erupt from the mist, smashing into the thin American lines. It is Hitler's final desperate gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein. The Allied front collapses. Confusion reigns. American units are surrounded. Communication lines are cut. And panic begins to filter up the chain of command. Eisenhower sits at Supreme Headquarters in Versailles. The reports are fragmentary, but the picture is clear. A massive wedge is being driven between the British and American armies. If the Germans reach Antwerp, the alliance could be split in two. The mood in the headquarters is grim. Generals are looking at maps with disbelief. But Eisenhower does not panic. He sees something the others miss. He sees the German army leaving its fortifications, exposing itself in the open. He issues a directive that stuns his staff, stating that the present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity and not of disaster. He knows he needs a counterattack. He needs a miracle. He calls a meeting at Verdun for the morning of December 19th. The conference room in Verdun is cold, heated only by a pot-bellied stove. The atmosphere is heavy with the smoke of cigarettes and the weight of potential defeat. Eisenhower stands before his top commanders, Bradley, Devers, and Patton. Eisenhower is serious, his face etched with strain. He points to the bulge in the map where the 101st Airborne is trapped at Bastogne. He turns to Patton. The Third Army is currently fighting hundreds of miles to the south, engaged in a heavy offensive in the Saar. Eisenhower asks the impossible question. George, how long will it take you to turn your army around and strike the German flank? The other generals expect Patton to ask for a week. A 90-degree turn of an entire army, moving 250,000 men and thousands of vehicles across icy roads in the middle of winter, is a logistical nightmare that should take days of planning. Patton doesn't hesitate. He looks Eisenhower in the eye and says, I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room goes silent. A few officers shift uncomfortably. It sounds like typical Patton bluster, reckless, impossible boasting. Even Eisenhower is skeptical, warning him not to be fatuous, and that if he tries to go that early, he won't be ready. But Patton is not boasting. He pulls a folder from his jacket. Before the meeting, anticipating the German move, he had already telephoned his staff. He had already issued the code words. The Third Army was already moving. In that freezing room, Eisenhower stares at the man he has spent 2 years managing, disciplining, and defending. He realizes that the very impulsiveness he feared is now the only thing that can save the Allied line. He gives the order, execute, December 20th to 22nd, 1944. The miracle unfolds on the icy roads of France. What happens next is widely considered the greatest logistical feat in the history of the U.S. Army. Patton disengages an entire army from combat, spins it 90 degrees and drives it north into the teeth of a blizzard. It is a movement of terrifying complexity. 133,000 tanks and trucks moving on a single axis, fighting ice, snow, and the enemy simultaneously. Patton is everywhere. He stands at crossroads in his open jeep, face raw from the cold, screaming at truck drivers, directing traffic with his riding crop, willing the column forward. He orders the chaplains to pray for good weather. He tells his staff, if we are not at Bastogne by Christmas, we should be shot. Inside the perimeter of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne is running out of ammunition. The German noose is tightening. They need a savior. December 26th, 1944. 4:50 p.m. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, leading the 37th Tank Battalion of Patton's 4th Armored Division, smashes through the German lines. The lead tank, Cobra King, rolls into the outskirts of Bastogne. The siege is broken. When the news reaches headquarters, the relief is overwhelming. Eisenhower sends a message to Patton. It is not a reprimand. It is not a lecture on logistics. It is pure, unadulterated admiration. He calls Patton's drive a brilliant piece of work. In this moment, the friction evaporates. Standing over the maps of a broken German offensive, Eisenhower knows he was right. The years of headaches, the slapping incidents, the political blunders, they were the price of admission for this specific victory. He had kept a dangerous tool in his box, and when the house was burning down, it was the only tool that worked. Patton wants to keep going. He wants to cut off the base of the Bulge and annihilate the German army entirely. But the crisis has passed, and the old dynamic returns. Eisenhower, ever the cautious strategist, orders a steady reduction of the pocket rather than the risky encirclement Patton demands. The war grinds on into the spring of 1945. The Third Army crosses the Rhine, tears through Germany, and reaches Czechoslovakia. But as the cannons finally go silent in May, the moment that Eisenhower saved Patton for is over. The war of movement ends. The war of occupation begins. And Eisenhower knows with a sinking dread that the man who won the Battle of the Bulge is completely unequipped to survive the peace. May 8th, 1945, VE Day. The champagne flows in London and New York, but in Bavaria, General George Patton is a man without a purpose. The destruction of the Wehrmacht has removed the only thing that gave his life meaning. Eisenhower appoints him military governor of Bavaria. It is a mistake. The skills required to govern a conquered nation, patience, nuance, political correctness, are the exact opposite of the skills required to conquer it. Eisenhower issues strict orders for denazification, demanding the removal of all former Nazi party members from administrative posts. Patton ignores the order. He looks at the rubble of German cities and decides he needs competence, not ideology. He keeps former Nazis in power to run the water plants, the police stations, and the hospitals. When questioned, he snaps that if he hires a doctor, he doesn't care about his politics. He cares if he can cure the patient. To Eisenhower, this is insubordination on a global stage. The press descends on Patton like sharks. In a catastrophic interview on September 22, 1945, Patton casually compares the Nazi Party to the Republicans and Democrats, treating it as just another political organization. The headline explodes across America. Eisenhower reads it with a cold resignation. He realizes that Patton has become a political, radioactive isotope. The war is over. The need for the mad dog is gone. Now he is just a liability. October 1945, Eisenhower summons Patton to his headquarters in Frankfurt. The meeting is short. There is no shouting. Eisenhower looks at his old friend, the man who taught him tank warfare, the man who saved the Bulge, and fires him. He strips Patton of his beloved Third Army and reassigns him to the 15th Army, a paper command with no troops and no mission, tasked only with writing a history of the war. Patton leaves the room broken. He tells his diary that he has been betrayed. 2 months later, on December 9th, 1945, Patton goes pheasant hunting near Mannheim. It is a grey, lazy Sunday. His Cadillac staff car, moving at barely 20 miles per hour, collides with a 2.5-ton army truck, turning into a depot. It is a minor fender bender. Everyone else in the car is unhurt. But Patton is thrown forward, his head striking the glass partition. He is instantly paralyzed from the neck down. He lies in the hospital in Heidelberg for 12 days. Eisenhower does not visit. He sends letters, he sends doctors, but he does not come. He knows that seeing the lion in a cage, broken and immobile, would be too much. On December 21st, the embolism strikes. Patton dies in his sleep. The problem child is gone. The silence that follows is deafening. December 24th, 1945, Christmas Eve. The funeral is held at the Luxembourg American Cemetery. Thousands of soldiers stand in the freezing rain to say goodbye to their commander, but one man is conspicuously absent. Dwight Eisenhower does not attend the funeral. Officially, the explanation is protocol. Supreme commanders rarely attend the funerals of subordinates to avoid overshadowing the ceremony. But privately, the absence speaks volumes. The relationship had been consumed by the war. There was nothing left to say. Eisenhower remains in his office, letting Patton belong to history and to the soil of the continent he helped liberate. 3 years later, in 1948, Eisenhower retires to write his massive memoir, Crusade in Europe. It is here, in the quiet of his study, that he finally articulates the admission he could never speak aloud while Patton was alive. He does not paint a portrait of a flawless hero. He writes with a brutal, clinical honesty. He admits that Patton was emotional, impulsive, and at times possessed a lack of balance. He confirms the exhausting toll of managing Patton's ego, the endless letters of apology, the sleepless nights worrying about what George would say next. But then comes the pivot. Eisenhower writes that although his emotional range was great, he had no equal in the ability to get the utmost out of his troops. He finally admits the core truth of their partnership. Logic alone does not win wars. Logistics do not inspire men to die. Eisenhower realizes that he provided the brain of the Allied war machine, but Patton provided the soul, the violent, irrational, necessary drive to conquer. He admits that while he often wanted to fire Patton, he never could, because Patton possessed a quality that could not be taught in staff college: the instinct of the killer. The admission is a heavy one. Eisenhower acknowledges that for civilization to be saved, he had to unleash a man who was, in many ways, uncivilized. He had to harness a force that was destructive by nature and point it at the enemy. And once the enemy was gone, he had to discard the weapon. Patton was not a man for the atomic age. He was a man for the mud and the blood of the Bulge. Eisenhower's final verdict is not one of regret, but of acceptance. He admits that George Patton was a man born for one specific moment in time, a moment that lasted from 1942 to 1945. And when that moment passed, the tragedy was that Patton did not pass with it. History often tries to simplify the Second World War into arrows on a map, but the truth is always found in the human collisions. The relationship between Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton was the engine of the Western Front, a friction that generated the heat necessary to burn down the Third Reich. Eisenhower's final admission was not one of guilt, but of the terrible clarity of command. He realized that a supreme commander cannot afford the luxury of unconditional friendship. He had to be a user of men. He used Bradley for stability. He used Montgomery for politics. And he used George Patton for the ugly, desperate work of annihilation. It was a transaction that cost them their brotherhood. Eisenhower ascended to the presidency, becoming the face of a stable, peaceful America. Patton died as he lived, turbulent, controversial, and restless. But in the quiet pages of history, Eisenhower's verdict stands firm. He knew that the world needs builders, and it needs diplomats. But sometimes when the night is darkest and the enemy is at the gate, the world needs a man who simply refuses to yield. Eisenhower provided the order. Patton provided the fury. And together, they saved the world.